So I'm recording this on election day here in the United States, and you can probably see, yeah, my I voted sticker here, and that's what I want to talk about. But more broadly, I want to be talking about meaning, and specifically like the meaning that we try to find in our lives. So and I'm going to be connecting this with the idea of story, and I think it'll make sense a little bit later. We often kind of think about ourselves as people in a story, like what is my place in my story, or how are things going in my life, and usually if we were going to talk about that with a friend, or we were going to talk about like how's your life going, and we sat down and started thinking about it, we would relate our lives in terms of story, and we'd often probably see ourselves as the hero or the center of that story, and how well maybe we see our lives going is connected with how well the story is going, and the meaning that's connected with it. Like if we feel like our story is going in a good positive direction, that things are looking up, that that gives us some kind of meaning and coherence to our lives. Like the choices and things and events in my life have led me to this point, and I see the upward trajectory, and that gives me a sense of meaning or purpose, that I'm reaching or attaining goals, or I'm making new goals for myself. And that not only gives me a sense of personal meaning, but perhaps even a sense of meaning more broadly, like meaning in a grander sense. Like maybe even I'm touching the meaning of life as things are going well for me, or oppositely, if things are going bad or poorly, I'm not feeling the meaning of life, or perhaps even I'm questioning whether there is even meaning to life, and as it relates to the meaning that I feel within myself, and whether I feel like the story of my life is progressing as I think it ought to, or as it should. Hopefully that makes sense. So let me try to tie that idea in with the other idea that's more specific to today in terms of voting and politics. This isn't specific only to Americans, but speaking primarily from an American point of view, we have conflicting messages about voting and what it means or it doesn't mean. And what I mean by that is that we have one message, is that voting is very meaningful, in the sense that you'll hear people talk about how this is how you make your voice heard, this is how you influence the government, this is your chance to do something, and in doing something you will be a part of it, and you will find meaning in the process of being involved. But also, we also get the message that voting doesn't really matter when the vote tallies come in at the end of the day or into the morning after, and you see the millions of votes that get cast, and then you see how much one candidate wins over another, and then you think, well, I didn't necessarily need to vote because they won by more than one. So we also get the message that our vote doesn't matter at all. So we have this conflicted message about voting in our society and in our culture, that it means everything and that it also means nothing. On top of that, most of us don't really like voting for who we vote for anyway. There's a few of us who are the political diehards, or maybe we have a connection with a particular candidate that we really feel strongly about, but that's, for the most part, we don't. The most part, most people who are voting don't. And maybe for a long time, and maybe it's been this way since the beginning of American democracy, that we often find ourselves voting for the lesser of two evils. It's not that we find one candidate particularly better than the other in all regards, but it's almost like instead we pick the one that we think will damage the government or the system the least, at least how we understand that, particularly in our own political makeup and ideas in our head. How does that actually translate into effects on policy or governmental agency, or the ability to actually influence politics or policy in regards to that? Like some people will phone or email their representative or their senator, but really what can they say? They can say, I was one of 4 million people who voted for you, so you should listen to me. Or perhaps you could say, I'm one of 13 million people that you supposedly represent, so you should listen to me, as opposed to the 12,999,999 other people who have different opinions than me. Like, and then how does even a person like a senator, who's one person, lead or represent such a diverse and numerous amount of people? Like, even from that standpoint, a person who is put in that position as a representative or a senator or a president or whatever, they're by necessity going to be making decisions that a good amount of people, even if it's a small minority of people, it'll still be a significant number of people that will disagree with and think that things are going in the wrong direction. For myself, I've been somebody who's been personally intensely interested in politics for a good amount of my life, going back all the way into my teenage years. And it's reflected in the books that I write, in the fact that I got a bachelor's degree in political science. I still think that politics is something that's worth understanding and studying. And I used to think that politics was a lot more important in my day-to-day life than I do now. And what I mean by that is I used to think that if I supported the right candidate or the right party or the right policies, then by me just supporting that or voting for that, I would change the world for the better and things would be better. And it seems to me that a lot of the political turmoil in the United States is kind of a function of these various things, the conflicting stories and narratives that we have, and the belief that our involvement in politics is going to have this profound effect in the way the nation goes and what happens in this country. And this is reflected in the way that most people talk about elections nowadays. And it seems like they've been talking about elections this way my entire life, and I don't know if they used to talk about elections this way 100 years ago. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But it's definitely within my lifetime. It's like every election is, quote unquote, the most important election of our lifetime, right? It doesn't matter what election is, like, it's always this one. You better go out and vote, or the bad people are going to win. So you got to make sure to vote this election. This election means everything. And then that election passes, and then the next election means everything. And it's like that the previous election that meant everything, actually it didn't mean everything. It's completely inconsequential. Actually, this election means everything. We're telling you the truth now. This election means everything. And then also on that hinges every swing in Congress or in the presidency or in the Supreme Court. That also means everything. And we've seen that in like the latest Supreme Court nomination, and the way that politics and elections go, like everything is of such important consequence. And depending on which side you find yourself in, on one side or the other, you're either every moment either making the sigh of relief is like, my guy won, and thank goodness, because if my guy hadn't won, then everything would go down in a ball of flames. Or if you happen to be on the other side, you have this sense of anxiety. It's like, oh no, this is the last like Jenga piece that's being taken out of American democracy, and this is the last one where everything's going to fall and everything's going to completely come apart into chaos and destruction and death. And that's what politics is now in this country, and we're like so dependent on every single thing happening, and we're so concerned either that this is the last thing that's just keeping us going, or this is going to be the thing that destroys us completely, that no wonder that most people think that you have to take a side and you can't be a centrist or a moderate. It's almost like to take the moderate or centrist position is like standing in the middle of a no man's land in the midst of a war, and you're just going to get riddled with bullets from either side if you try to take a more moderate or centrist position. And for a lot of people, that is politics is war right now, and you've got to take a side. And every battle is crucial, and that's why every election is the most important election of our lifetime, because the past is the past, it's gone, but this battle means everything, and this might be the place where you die, or you're victorious, or your cause dies, or your cause is victorious, and that's where we happen to be, and it's strange and it's weird, but that's where we are. So understanding where we are politically, ultimately, that gives each and every one of us a feeling of self-worth or accomplishment whenever our side wins, or we have this feeling of ultimate defeat and failure and fear if our side loses. So each successive election or political appointment or event is just steeped with all of this meaning that we think we get from it, or that we think we might lose from it. And it's like almost like our belief that my involvement intensely matters. And I hope at this point you don't take me wrong, because I do believe what you do does matter. And I think it matters tremendously. But when we're talking about the idea of like political stuff happening one way or the other, the movement of nations and the world, there isn't any one of us who has the foresight or the knowledge or the expertise to be able to say that with 100% certainty, if this thing happens, then this is going to be the end, or if this thing happens, this is the best thing that could possibly happen. Like, that's part of like this whole political process, is the millions upon millions of us trying to negotiate the future and how we best move forward into the future, and how we best govern ourselves in the present. And there's millions upon millions of us, whether we vote or not, making choices for good or for ill, morally good choices or morally bad choices, and we're all affecting history as it's being written. And it's almost because of the fact that there's so many people interacting on this grand scale that like none of us have the ability to actually know what's going to happen or how it will happen. Or if this thing happens, like, do we know what all the consequences will be? And even if I got my way and the world turned out the way that I thought that it should, and all of the people that I wanted to vote for got into power, or all of the policies that I advocated for actually got passed and enforced, I still don't know if that's going to be what is going to make the world better. So personally for myself, I've found myself becoming more and more moderate over time. And that's for a few reasons. One reason is that I worked as a preacher in my 20s. And so I saw some examples some very close examples, in fact, of preachers who really saw themselves as advocating for one political ideology over another. And I saw that as a wrong way to go about it, because I don't think a preacher's job is to convert people to the church of Republicans or the church of Democrats or the church of conservatives or the church of liberals. And my job, especially as a preacher, should not be to convert people to my own political understanding of things. There's a few places to go in the New Testament to talk about that. One very famous place to go to is Romans chapter 13, where Paul talks about the idea that a Christian should submit to the government and to submit to governmental authorities. Now, in the first century, that would mean Roman authorities. And we would, I think almost anybody, whether they were Christian or atheist or anywhere in between or another religion, would look at the Romans and Roman government, and as modern people, we would look at the Romans, especially the emperors, and call them all very immoral people. And the Roman government did various things that were not good things. And yet, as a Christian, Paul says our responsibility as Christians is to submit to the government and submit to governing authorities. Paul doesn't give an exception of only submit to governing authorities that are good and moral and godly. In fact, Paul says that all governments are established by God. And that's a whole big thing to talk about. And maybe I'll do a different video about that at some other later point. But the point I want to make with that is just that the political realities that you find yourself in some ways, should not affect how you live your life or what you do. In a sense, especially as a Christian, your responsibility is to act like a Christian no matter what government is in place. No matter whether there is a government in place that is very friendly to you, or if you happen to be under a government that is very hostile to you, which is what Christians in the first and second century and under the Roman government found themselves in oftentimes. Another example is who Jesus chose as his disciples, which is something that you can read over very quickly and not even realize if you're not familiar with Jewish, they didn't call them political parties back then, but Jewish parties or Jewish groups, and how the various Jewish groups reacted to Roman oppression and Roman governance. One of the apostles of Jesus is Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots were people who were very anti-Roman. And some of the Zealots were very violent, rebellious people who believed that it was the responsibility of the Jewish people to violently overthrow the Romans. At the same time, Jesus not only selected someone like Simon the Zealot, but Jesus also selected Matthew the tax collector. So Matthew was someone who was actively working for the Romans and collecting taxes for the Romans. So in one sense, you could say that Jesus chose someone who was pro-Roman and someone who was anti-Roman, and made both men his disciples. Jesus chose from the political right and the political left, and everywhere in between. And so Jesus, and especially as a Christian, we should be seeing ourselves as above politics. We should be realizing that, I guess as the old hymn goes, here we are but straying pilgrims. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. There's something coming later. And all of the governments of this world either have passed away or are in the process of passing away. And just like we as individuals don't last forever on this earth, neither do the governments of this earth as well, and there's something better coming. But I kind of guess going along with that idea is I've become more moderate in my politics because I've considered my mortality a lot more seriously. Because whatever happens politically now or into the future, eventually I won't be here. Eventually I won't be voting. Unless unless some political parties put me on the voting record and make me vote a particular way, but I won't be doing it. I'm not going to be around eventually, and I won't be affecting or participating in politics anymore. My life is but a fleeting moment. I'm but a vapor. And I'm only here momentarily, and then I'm gone. And it seems in some ways that this obsession with politics seems silly in the light of eternity and in the light of my momentary existence here on this earth. The time scale that we're talking about becomes so much more impressive, and then the language of like, this election is the most important election of my lifetime becomes laughable. And in that way, like, it becomes laughable when people who are Christians make these political things so much more important than what they really are eternally. And I think that I think for a lot of Christians who take their politics really seriously, they do so for a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest reason is that they see this earthly government as a way to force people to be good. In the sense that if we elect the right people that have the right positions and make the right laws, we will force people to act morally and be good people. And we'll make laws that promote good things as we see them as good, and we'll make laws against certain things that we see as morally bad or as wrong. And in doing so, we'll make the nation more moral, and by it being more moral, it will last longer. Now, ironically, the non-religious, secular people who also obsess over politics for the exact same reason. They believe the exact same thing about government, that it's the place of government to make laws, to force people to do the right things, and ban and prohibit bad things from happening. The only difference between the Christians who are very politically motivated and the non-religious or non-Christian people who are politically motivated is that they disagree about what are the good things to promote and what are the bad things to ban or prohibit. But in both cases, they both see the government as the arbiter of moral good and moral bad. And both sides are putting their faith and hope in the government, in the state, to save us, in a sense, from ourselves, to promote good moral things and to ban bad moral things. And so in that sense, you can understand why politics has become the battleground and war that it has become, because politics is where it's at. It's the state that is the final arbiter of good and evil. And I am a soldier on the side of good, promoting the right morals. And there's nothing beyond that, especially for the person who believes that all there is to this life is the here and now. And there's nothing beyond them. Their mortality compels them to be more politically involved because this is all there is. And if the state is the one that makes the decisions, they've got to influence the state in the right way. So then politics doesn't just become the end goal, it becomes the vehicle by which we force other people to live in the way that we think everyone should live. But most of us don't really have all that much power. We get one vote, presumably. Most of us don't have the money or the power or the influence to really affect things, to really influence who gets elected and what policies get passed and what laws get enacted and what laws get enforced. And as I mentioned before, we're all going to eventually be gone. So what should we do, and how should we view ourselves and our power or the lack thereof in regards to all of this? For me, what it's come down to is for me to realize that I am most likely not the main character in the story that's being told. And what I mean by that is that, like, in the story of the world, I'm clearly not the main character. In the story of the United States, I'm not the main character. In the story of my state or my city, or even my family, I'm probably not the main character. At best, I'm a side character. But even in that, I'm most likely not even a character that gets mentioned. If I'm lucky, I'm a side character that gets mentioned offhand in just one sentence. But most likely, in the grand narrative of the universe, in the grand narrative of the United States, or of this generation, or however you want to think about the story that's being told right now, and there's many of them, but in most all of them, I'm so obscure that I'm going to pass without being mentioned or remembered, as millions and billions of people before me have. In reality, the stories that are being told, the main characters, there's only a handful compared to the people who don't get mentioned or remembered. So that brings me to, I always got to bring a book into this that I always think about. And the book that I'm going to talk about is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. And it's been a long time since I've read this book, so if I get some of the things wrong, please forgive me. But in The Last Unicorn, there's a character who's a wizard. He's named Schmendrick. And he can't perform magic, or at least he can't perform the magic that he thinks that he needs and he ought to do. But there are points in the book where Schmendrick does magic and does these really amazing, awesome things. And he can only, in the course of the story, you find out that he can only perform magic when the story requires him to. Now, The Last Unicorn is what you would call a meta story or a meta narrative, in the sense that it's a story that knows it's a story. And characters like Schmendrick know, in a sense, that they are a character in a story. And one of Schmendrick's things is that he really desires to be the main character and have his own agency and decide when and how he can use and perform magic. And every time that he tries to perform magic that isn't to the service of the story, he can't do it. It's only when his actions align with the purpose of the story that he can perform magic. And so really, by the end of the story, it's when Schmendrick recognizes and accepts that he is not the main character, that he is a side character, that his role in the story is not to be the hero, but be the person who helps the hero. It's then that he becomes the magician that he ought to be. Now, what's really interesting in that is then by the end of the story, he's this all-powerful magician. But he's no different than what he was at the beginning. He still can't perform magic on command because it's not in service of the story. But it's almost like it's his attitude to his ability or inability to cast magic that makes him a master wizard or a wizard who can't do anything. He knows his place now. He knows when he cannot cast magic. And so now he's never going to cast magic when he can't. So he's never going to betray his inability to cast magic at various times. Now he's always going to cast magic in the right times at the right moments. And that's really the difference between a novice magician and a master magician in that story. It's not the ability, but it's the submission to your role in the story. And when you submit, then you become powerful. When you understand that you're the side character, then you can flourish. And now I'm going to bring a little bit of Bible into this as well, because I'm starting to teach a Bible class at my church, and it's geared around the northern kingdom of Israel, which is a really interesting way to set up a class, because I don't know that I've ever been in a church that specifically had a class just on the northern kingdom of Israel, mainly for the reason that all the kings of Israel, after the kingdom splits into two, and there's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, all of the kings of Israel in the Bible are regarded as evil kings. And so there aren't any good kings. And yet, the stories are all like centered around these kings and around some of the prophets, Elijah and Elisha, mostly, and a few others. And we're dealing with a nation that is morally corrupt and kings who are morally corrupt. And I just had my first class just a few days ago. And one of the things that came up is that the period of the northern kingdom is roughly 200 years, a little bit more than 200 years. And so there's 200 years of history that's compacted into these small stories. And we're dealing with a handful of people, and they're mostly kings and prophets. And these kings and prophets do big things. They fight wars and they make alliances, and they call fire down from heaven, and there's all these kinds of things that happen in the northern kingdom. But then you realize is that, okay, I'm getting like a couple dozen people in these stories. And over the course of 200 years, we're dealing with thousands, if not millions of people who lived in the northern kingdom and died in the northern kingdom and never get mentioned in the Bible. And the realization that I'm most likely not a king, and I'm most likely not a prophet. I'm one of the unmentioned people. And what is the story going on with all of them as the kings and prophets argue with one another and do the things that they do? There's this story in 1 Kings chapter 18 where Elijah is coming back to confront King Ahab. And King Ahab is described in the Bible as pretty much the worst king that Israel ever had, at least on a moral level. And so Ahab is the worst king that's ever been and ever will be. And the prophet Elijah is probably the most important and most beloved and revered prophet of the Old Testament to the Jewish people and even to Christians as well. Elijah is extremely important. So you have this morally good person and this morally bad person, and maybe you could even put them to the extremes. The most morally good person at the time and the most morally bad person at the time. And there's a king and a prophet. And they're contending with one another. And so Elijah, there's been this drought that Elijah declared, and it's been going on for 3 years, and now Elijah is going to come back, and he's going to confront King Ahab. And Elijah comes to this man named Obadiah. Now, you might have heard that name in reference to one of the books of the Bible that's also called Obadiah, but it's a different Obadiah, so it's a different person. And Obadiah is a servant of King Ahab. And Elijah finds Obadiah, and he tells Obadiah to go back to King Ahab and inform him that Elijah's going to come to King Ahab. And there's this interaction between Obadiah and Elijah that I won't get into, but one of the things that Obadiah says to Elijah is that even though Obadiah is a servant of King Ahab, so Obadiah is somebody who is serving the most immoral man living in that nation at the time. Obadiah has secretly been hiding 100 prophets of God in 2 caves and feeding them. And this is after 3 years of drought and famine. Obadiah has somehow been able to find enough provisions for 100 people and hide them from an immoral man who would most likely have those men executed. So Obadiah is placed in history in a really odd place. He's the servant to Ahab, who is an evil king, but he's doing the best that he can in the position that he's at. And he's saving 100 prophets of God. He's expending his own resources. He's doing it under the nose of this evil man. And Obadiah just gets mentioned in this one chapter. And afterwards, Obadiah just fades. He's not mentioned again. And if there's anybody who we're like in that story, we're not the Ahab. And we're not the Elijah. If anything, we're Obadiah. We just get mentioned in passing in one story. And we're not calling fire from heaven. We're not fighting wars or making alliances or making these political choices. We're just doing the best we can with what we have. And so, I almost see that as Obadiah has accepted that he's not king, so he can't change things politically, maybe the way that he would wish to. But he's also finding the opportunities in his life, apart from politics, to accomplish what he can accomplish in his life and to help those that he can help. Maybe because he's embraced that he's just a side character. Have you thought about that? Maybe the best that we can do is just accept our role as it is. Whatever that might be, and maybe like Schmendrick in The Last Unicorn or Obadiah in the Old Testament, maybe we should just embrace the story that we've been given. And not believe that we can or we have the ability to do more than what we can. Because you can do something very positive in the world. Obadiah saved 100 men. It's very much more likely that you're going to have a positive impact in the world, not based on who or what you vote for, but on if you were a good person or not. And by being a good person in the sense of taking care of your family, doing what's right, even if it's at a hard personal cost to you. Being content in the life that you are currently leading. whether it's a big role or a small role. And regardless of whether or not you are as influential as a president or a king, I often wonder how many unnamed people in the immemorial past made decisions of consequence that we don't even know. And because they made a good moral choice or they made a bad moral choice, they have affected history going forward. And we don't even know. We don't even know who they are. We don't even know what those decisions were. And yet we are living as a result of the consequences of the decisions that millions and billions of people before us have made. And most of them we don't even remember. Sure, we remember the large, profound movements of history. But how much could have changed if one person did something slightly different? If someone who was unnamed and unremembered did the right thing instead of the wrong thing, or did the wrong thing instead of the right thing, how much may history have changed completely and utterly? I don't know. So it's important to vote, because it's one choice that may or may not affect the future going forward. But more importantly, it's important to do what's right, to the best of your ability, and to the best that you know what right is. But the world's going to go on with or without you. And eventually, it will go on without you. And whether or not your politics won out, and regardless, you're still responsible for what you do. Even if the tides of public opinion are against you, and even if the government doesn't turn out the way that you want, or even if the government opposes you, you are responsible for your moral decisions. And even if no one else thinks that you're important, your decisions do matter. And they have consequences that will flood out far beyond you and have a reach far beyond your lifetime. Your decisions matter. Only potentially not in the way that you think they will. So that's what I've been thinking about. If you listen to this, thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. Put it down in the comments below. If you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you have some other examples to talk about, I would love to hear them. So let me know. And until next time, God bless you.